Well, thank you. I'm David Sanger. I'm White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times and author of The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. And we are here today to discuss the war, sabotage, and fear part of all of that. But I just wanted to start off by thanking Google for having us out here and thanking Meredith, who you just heard from, because as somebody on the news side of the New York Times, I can tell you that without the work that she and her colleagues have done, the kind of independent journalism, including the huge commitment to covering cyber and its related geopolitical issues, we wouldn't be able to do. So thank you, Meredith, for all you've done there. We have a great panel today, and I want to introduce all three of them. All great friends who I've dealt with in years of covering cyber issues. To my immediate right, Jen Easterly. It's a West Point graduate, 20-year Army veteran. When I first met Jen, she was working for Condoleezza Rice when she was National Security Advisor, and we have re-met since. She ran Morgan Stanley's cybersecurity operation, and currently she's the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Royal Hansen leads Google's engineering team that focuses on privacy, safety, and cybersecurity. For 2 decades, he was also in the financial services side of all of this, and somebody I turn to often when I'm confused, which in this realm is frequently. And then the Honorable Sue Gordon. Sue is the former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, a job she had from 2017 to 2019. That's right, she had to be Deputy DNI during the Trump administration. That's a separate panel we'll have to have at some point. She had more than 3 decades at the CIA, but she has moved up through the analyst ranks. She really brought the CIA into the cyber world, advised the president on intelligence matters and operational leadership. Jen, let me start with you, and I really want to start about the 2 different issues. First is, for those here who don't understand completely what CISA is, since it's a relatively new organization, tell us a little bit about that and how it differs from the many other groups that handle cyber in the US government, from NSA and Cyber Command to the FBI's role, and of course the White House cyber coordinators. And then I really want to turn you to the question of the big lessons that we've learned from the Ukraine war. Since this is the first kinetic war we have had between 2 very savvy cyber adversaries. The war has seemed more like World War II at moments in the shelling, more like World War I at moments in the trench warfare, but it's had this fascinating cyber underlay to it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, great to be here. So CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, we like security so much, we had to have it twice in our name. So we're the newest agency in the federal government. We were actually established in 2018, and today is our 4th birthday, to be America's cyber defense agency. So our mission is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And when you say infrastructure, people think, oh, the IT folks. But critical infrastructure is just what we use to get gas at the pump and food at the grocery store and money from the ATM and our power and our water and our healthcare and our education. So it really is the networks and systems that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And in other places where I've worked, in the Army, at the White House, at the National Security Agency for over a decade, you could argue that the government has monopoly power. But in cybersecurity, we are just a partner with state and local colleagues and a partner with the private sector. And so what we spend a lot of time doing is building those trusted partnerships. And what we've done over the past year as a result of the Russian unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is to make sure that America is able to defend itself in the potential of Russian retaliation on the US. So what are the lessons learned? What have we seen? Well, I'd say probably 4 things. First of all, and I have to say that most people miss this, but we have seen Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine, but quite frankly, they did not have the impact that was expected, and I think an incredible amount of admiration for the Ukrainian cyber forces, which have been able to deal with this pretty effectively. So kudos to them, and I guess the lesson is, if you've been the Russian cyber sandbox for over a decade, you get pretty darn good at your mission, and so I think we can learn from that in America. I think the second is, look, this is largely a kinetic war, and the Russians, who are very good, are not going to waste exotic cyber tools on a place where they're basically launching missiles against critical infrastructure. And so they continue to perpetrate cyber attacks, but they're not using anything exotic like we saw in America with the SolarWinds supply chain compromise, or even a ransomware group against Colonial Pipeline.
Jen, you're essentially saying that if you're going to take out the power supply in Ukraine,
Use a missile.
It's more efficient, and it also doesn't reveal your other capabilities.
Yeah, but I think we should not think that Russia is not capable of having a significant cyber effect on our critical infrastructure here at home. So as we've said, we need to, here in America, have our shields up. We need to remain vigilant. We need to remain aware of the threat. And we need to work together across the federal government with critical infrastructure to ensure that we are prepared for any sort of retaliation, whether it comes from the Russians or state-aligned criminal groups, or something like a cascading attack with NotPetya, which we saw in 2017, most expensive cyber attack affecting multinationals around the world, and you're well aware of that.
So one quick follow-up, and then I want to ask Royal if you would step in on what you've seen also in Ukraine from Google's side. Once the sanctions started up on Russia, our expectation was that the Russian reaction would be, okay, you want to do financial sanctions on us? We're going to do financial sanctions on you. And the best way for them to have done that would be a cyber attack, maybe along the lines of SolarWinds, which, if NotPetya was the most expensive, I would say SolarWinds was perhaps the most innovative, and it was happening just at the time that the Biden administration was preparing to take over. Why haven't we seen the Russians do that?
There's a lot of speculation around it. I would go back to, for folks who are interested in this, there's a great article written by Joe Nye that David knows well from Harvard. It's called Deterrence and Dissuasion in Cyberspace. And he talks about the framework of 4 types of deterrence. Deterrence by norm setting, deterrence by economic entanglements, deterrence by denial or resilience, and deterrence by punishment. I think, at the end of the day, there's a bit of deterrence by punishment, which means that there is this ambiguity of where the red lines are in terms of what the U.S. would do if the Russians launched a cyber attack. And I think the president was very clear with Putin last year that launching on our critical infrastructure is unacceptable. So I think there was a bit of that. But I also like to think there was a bit of deterrence by denial, as we were able to work with the private sector, work with our state and local colleagues to warn them of the threat and everything they needed to do to mitigate risk to their critical infrastructure. So touch wood, we've, as a country, become more secure and resilient, but we have a long, long way to go to ensure that America is safe in cyberspace.
So, Royal, I would say that one of the most interesting things I have seen happen in this war is the role that companies took. Google famously, its employees did not want to get involved in an AI program for the Pentagon a number of years ago. Yeah. But boy, Google and Amazon and Microsoft have been all in on this war. Maybe because of the moral clarity of it, maybe because of the fear of what would happen when it spreads beyond the borders. But tell us what you have seen and what you haven't seen within Google's networks, and what lessons you've emerged from on this.
Yeah, I want to build off of Jen's first point, which is this war has gone on in cyberspace since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so in addition to the Ukrainians being that sandbox for Russian attackers, Google as a global internet company is very much in those crosshairs. We track 300 nation-state organizations. We know them by names and signatures and technical approaches. We track almost 1,000 criminal organizations. So during that last 8 years, we have been in active confrontation with attackers from Russia, just like the individuals in Ukraine. And I think while the invasion was certainly a change in the war, it was not a radical change in the cybersecurity side. These were attacks we had been seeing for years. And I think the lesson was you need options in cybersecurity. It's not that you don't know how everyone will behave, as we're just talking about. So we took, as a couple of examples, in the 2016 election, we had developed, in the wake of that, an advanced protection program, which, as Meredith was talking, I was thinking as well, is really designed to protect our highest risk individuals online. Those could be campaigns, they could be election poll workers, and they could be journalists in high-risk locations.
You know, I got that little red
You
bar
get
on my
that.
Gmail that said, a nation-state actor is trying to get into your email.
So just as an example, in 21, we had 43,000 of our users on Gmail be attacked in named ways by nation-states.
Yeah.
So we rolled the entire country of Ukraine into that advanced protection program as the tanks rolled over the border, because the last thing those individuals were worried about was their email. And so it was in the tool bag from all those years of defending. The other example is the technology that it takes to keep search and maps and YouTube up all over the globe 24/7 defends against denial of service attacks, which you'll hear about. The Russian threat actors began to attack government, news, and philanthropic sites in Ukraine to keep citizens on the ground from knowing what to do. We took a version of that technology, which we prepared for work with philanthropic organizations, and put it in front of 200 sites and kept it up for people on the ground to get information in Ukraine. Nobody would have imagined that was exactly the way it would unfold.
A lot of companies, several companies moved the whole country to the cloud, basically, the government to the cloud.
And I think that's a good example. Options are more important than having the exact plan.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I have to say, one of my favorites is that on the day of the invasion, the way Google Maps changed to show people ways out of the country.
We talked a lot about this the other day. It's one of the fascinating stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sue, there's been another element to this whole conflict, which is basically the information war piece of this. And if you're the Chinese and you're looking at what mistakes the Russians made, one of them may be allowing Zelensky to keep talking to his people every day. And yet there has been a huge cyber-enabled, not really a cyber attack, but a cyber-enabled information war on both sides. What struck you about that? Because it's something you were warning of for years in your time in the intelligence community.
Yeah, so if you look at Ukraine, it was, in fact, an information war. Now, the United States actually did a pretty good job on the information disorder side that was being promulgated by Russia to counter it by doing something that is not natural for the intelligence community, which was to share secrets openly to try and counter a campaign. So I think let's not forget the information disorder side of it, because shaping public opinion is a huge part of the cyber landscape, because cyber is fundamentally about eroding trust, which hurts free and open societies more than others. So our adversaries know that. I think the other thing that's interesting about Ukraine is Russia is very good at integrated operations. And what you saw in Ukraine is they didn't have to use cyber for everything. They used cyber with things in order to achieve effects. And then your question about China. They have different intentions than Russia. They have different things they want to protect. They are very capable. They're perhaps not so integrated. But I would expect, if you imagine that Ukraine is one bookend and China-Taiwan is another, I think what you're going to expect to see is much more shaping of the battlefield, much more with information, much more involvement of private sector companies as both attack surface and decision makers, because their play is much more of an economic play going forward. And then to something we've talked about is just the choice that companies are going to have to make to be prepared for that going forward. So I think it played out about as I expected in Ukraine, and I don't expect China to be the same at all. Not that the same tools aren't available, but the methodology that they'll be employed will be very different.
And that takes me, Sue, to one last issue on China I wanted to particularly raise with you. I spend most of my days thinking and reporting in the realm of the emerging world we live in which we are in conflict simultaneously with our two major nuclear superpower adversaries. For Russia, it has been fairly straightforward in trying to deprive them of the technology they need to conduct the war and the money they need. But with China, it's been much more complex because we have this huge technological interdependency with them. Nonetheless, in the past few months, a little bit under the radar, you have seen the Biden administration deprive China of the most advanced semiconductors and the equipment to go make them. Is this a long-term strategy that will work? Because it strikes me that all you buy is some time.
Well, I think in this world, all you ever buy is time, right? The notion is not absolute protection, but rather advantage at any one time. I think the reason why the strategy is so important is because it is clear that China has been working for years to acquire capability, the piece parts that will allow them to compete and building their own with it. But what we're trying to deny now is their ability to operationalize it. There's a huge difference between having a capability and putting that capability to use to good effect. And so doubling down on protections, controls, in order to ensure that China does not acquire the ability to put things together in the same way, manufacture in the same way, and in a weird sort of way decouple from us so significantly that we don't have an understanding of what they're doing. So I think that's what you're trying to do. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that. So, my view, Russia, and this is sort of the old trope, Russia is a hurricane and China is climate change. And I fundamentally believe if we and like-minded partners in the West are not making the investments that we need to make in human capital and intellectual capital and research and development, in capability over the next 10 years, 10, 15 years, we will lose the battle of technology innovation. I fundamentally believe that. I mean, the $52 billion for the CHIPS Act is really a relative drop in the bucket for what we need to be doing with artificial intelligence, with biotech, with facial recognition, with 6G, with quantum, with a secure and open internet, frankly.
So I'd say it even more bluntly than that. Protection is one thing, but you have to have something worthy to protect, right? We have to equally invest in ourselves to make sure that we have the raw materials for us to keep advancing, being a global leader, at the exact same time that you're trying to retard the use. So I totally agree with you.
Sue, we spent a lot of time discussing when you were still in office the 5G effort, which was an effort to keep China from being able to install 5G networks. But what we never quite made our way to is being able to give the alternative to build those networks in the U.S. or the West so that we could replace them.
That battle. I mean, we need to learn the lessons of underinvestment in 5G and now start investing in 6G, or else we're going to cede that whole market to authoritarian regime-linked firms, which is ungood.
And that's why this audience is so important, because back when I started, the government was the hotbed of all the really cool things, right? We were the ones that started, knew it was important if the government started. Now, so much of our engine is outside of governmental control. And so understanding those things that are strategically significant, 5G is a great example. 5G is not just next 4G, it was strategically significant, but I don't think we as a nation thought of it as such. And so that we didn't engage in the conversation and the partnership that would allow us to make different decisions on every level.
It wasn't a national security debate until it was too late.
Right.
So, Jen, let me take you briefly to the election. We covered the politics of it with David and Carl quite amusingly along the way. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about what didn't happen. In the run-up to the election, you were on TV a lot, making the case that we need to have our shields up, as you often say. We were worried about a number of different things. Foreign interference, of which is pretty hard to do in a midterm election.
Yeah.
We were worried about the election of secretaries of state who your organization works with, many of whom were election deniers from the 2020 group. Almost none of them got elected in the end. We were worried about people basically arguing that the counting of the vote, including the machines themselves, was fraudulent. That didn't happen.
Right. So look, elections are really the golden thread that is woven through the fabric of our democracy. If that unravels, then our republic is at risk. So what we do, and this was after 2016, when election infrastructure was designated as critical infrastructure, our job, because the federal government does not run elections, our job was to work with state and local election officials to ensure they had the information, the resources, the capabilities to run free, fair, safe, secure, resilient elections. And as I said many times, the environment that these election officials were operating in 2022 was the most complex that we have ever seen. As David just said, cyber threats, nation states, ransomware, insider threats from those who had institutional knowledge, physical threats of harassment, intimidation, violence at polling places, and rampant disinformation, despite the fact that there is no evidence based on extensive audits and recounts that 2020 was in any way compromised. And these were threats that could sow discord among Americans, undermine the confidence in the integrity of our elections, and incite violence. And I think everyone in this room should understand that election officials are not these backroom bureaucrats. Election officials are the people we see at the grocery store. They're at the PTA, they're at the bowling alley, they're our friends, our neighbors, our relatives. And the fact that they were being intimidated and harassed, I think is the most worrying thing about our democracy, because they deserve our support, our admiration, our respect, and they deserve to be safe. So I was absolutely very happy to see that the physical threats that I was most concerned about didn't come to bear. I was also very glad to see that even in elections that were close, and still counts are happening now, that there wasn't a huge wave of pushback on the actual counts themselves. Now, the thing that I would ask everybody in this room is to think about the fact that many of these election officials who've been doing this for decades have now decided that they don't want to be election officials anymore. So a couple things. I spent 20 plus years in the military. Everyone thanks me for my service. If you see an election official, thank them for their service, because they have been busting their ass to ensure that our democracy is safe and secure, but many of them are leaving their jobs. So the next 2 years will be just as complex in terms of making sure that we have fair, free, safe, secure elections. And this is a nonpartisan activity, by the way. Ensuring election security is not party, it's not politics. It's all about safeguarding our democracy, and our democracy is very fragile. So vote, be a poll worker, support your election officials, and learn about elections. It's actually very complicated. It's why it's great that the news follows these things and helps us make sense of it. But it's really important that we all see we play a role in safeguarding our democracy.
So, Royal, one of the phrases you hear a lot in the industry as we think going forward is security by design. It basically means building the security in from the beginning of new products, which is not the way the internet started. It started as this wide open highway, and only later on did people start thinking about having a few safe exits and maybe, a breakdown lane. So talk a little bit about where we are headed in that. Passwordless approaches, ways to use AI to actually fight back against the ransomware, the spam, and most importantly, the stealing of credentials that we've seen so much.
So a couple thoughts on it. One, cybersecurity is unusual in that it has an active adversary. It's not like the weather or sort of acts of God in some ways. This is someone on the other side is reacting to every defensive move you make. And so the hardest thing about defending is updating your plan and updating your approach. So for instance, legacy infrastructure is sort of one of the biggest problems we have as a society. And at the pace that we're digitizing, everything we talk about here today has some digital plan or some digital innovation behind it. The key, and I think there's a thing of Gmail, how many people have ever had to go patch their Gmail account or update the software that runs Gmail? Doesn't exist,
Right.
doesn't happen. But that's not the case with the vast majority of infrastructure that runs, that we run our lives on. And so there's a real need to, as we modernize, to go to in this case, it could be a cloud-like service, a cloud service, where you're getting automatic updates. This isn't a one-time improvement of our defenses. This is going to be something we have to always be doing. There's a dynamic nature to it. On your second point about the password question, and I love Jen's campaigns around multi-factor authentication, because if you did one thing as an individual, it would be either for your email or your bank or sort of your critical services, enabling that second factor that you get. But as an example, and I think this is where AI and sort of the innovation behind the scenes, it's not in making it fancy that we win, it's in making it easy and silent behind the scenes. So we've rolled almost 400 million people into multi-factor authentication on Gmail without them knowing, because we analyzed the way they were using our services and they were getting the benefits of those controls, and they don't have to go through the stumbling blocks that oftentimes stop people from enabling it. So to me, it's about getting to a state where people are healthy and they don't even know it.
So, Sue and Jen, we're just down to a few minutes left, and I want to ask you both about how companies should be thinking about this, because there's a great temptation during most of the time I've covered cybersecurity where CEOs sort of took the view, this is a technical problem, this is why I hire a CISO, call me if you got a problem, but I'm not here to think about this. Then Target came along, and suddenly after they lost data on millions of users, their CEO was invited to go spend some more time with his family. And then we had a series of other cases, including Equifax, where their CEO was invited to go spend more time with their family. Has this made a big enough difference? And in the end, are we in a world yet where companies think about these decisions as a national security threat? I'm going to start with you, Sue, and then
Okay, I'll
ask
make three
Jen.
quick points, and then I'll turn it over to Jen to correct me. One, in a digitally connected world, the companies and citizens are the threat surface, and so that also means they're national security decision makers, right? So you have to be thinking about your role and your corporate decisions, not just from the perspective of profitability. I know this is hard, but also from the perspective of what you're endangering. Decisions about supply chain became front and center with the pandemic, but there are lots more of that. So one, you are national security decision makers. Two, yeah, this after the fact thinking about it, let me explain something to you. You are either the target or you're the transportation. Not a single person in this room should be thinking, yeah, it ain't gonna happen to me. I'm not interested. I'm pretty sure we didn't think beef was gonna be a target until we realized that food security is an important thing. Target or transportation, so you have to do it. And the last one is, there are so many things your CISOs and your teams are doing technically, and you ought to care about those things, but what you can do is to understand what your risk profile is. What is important to you? Is it continuity of operations? What data do you have? What do you need to protect? What would an adversary be interested in? Because again, cyber, though it is technically instantiated, is fundamentally about an intention to do something that they want over you.
And Jen, you have till, what I think, beginning of January to put together a continuity of the economy plan, or
Can't
at
believe
least
you have time to be here.
so Congress thinks. But tell us a little bit about about how you think about that for the U.S. government, but then how corporate executives should think about that.
The continuity, because that's a fascinating topic, the continuity of the economy plan. No. What I want to do actually is really pivot off Sue's point and sort of answer your question. I think, look, for this audience, there are 3 things that we need to do to ensure that our nation is defended and that we can continue to be able to provide essential services to Americans. The first thing, as Sue was saying, CEOs need to treat cyber risk as business risk, as reputational risk, as existential to your company, and if your critical infrastructure as fundamental to national security, economic security, and public health and safety. You can't delegate it to the IT guys. You have to treat it as a matter of good governance, and frankly, I think CEOs need to embrace cyber as corporate cyber responsibility. We all talk about CSR and all of the ESG metrics. I think we need to have CCR, not only because it's a great rock band, but also because cyber needs to be seen as a social good as well. So that's 1. 2, every American from K through gray needs to understand what we need to do to keep ourselves cyber safe. So creators out there, CMOs, we need the Got Cyber Milk campaign. We need the this is your cyber on drugs, right? We need something that's a narrative that people are like, their brain's not going to turn off because it's too technical and nerdy, yep. and really help everybody understand how to keep themselves cyber safe. How many people, to Royal's point, have multi-factor authentication enabled?
That's pretty good.
Okay, that's actually pretty good. That's pretty good. You know, the basics of MFA, which is like the most important thing that has the worst name to it. Like, who would call something that important something you can't even frickin' pronounce? So MFA, software updates, password keeper, and phishing training. You do those 4 things, you actually will be pretty good unless the Russians decide that they really want to come after you. So those 4 things. Plus, we need to keep our kids cyber aware. They're digital natives, not digital immigrants like us, and they need to know how to keep themselves safe. Last thing, I just want to reinforce what Royal said. Look, we have accepted this crazy cultural norm that technology comes full of vulnerabilities. And you go back to Ralph Nader, it's unsafe at any speed. Technology underpins everything we do. You have to build security that's secure by design, secure by default, so we're not putting the burden on the least capable of defending themselves, users who are not technical. And that needs to be something that needs to fundamentally change, and it's about transparency on things like multi-factor authentication. It's software bill of materials, which is like the Campbell's soup of software. What's in your software, so you know. And it's really a movement of change for radical transparency about what's in all these products so that we can all together raise the baseline of cybersecurity of our country so we don't ultimately have to worry too much about continuity of the economy because our country is safe, secure, and resilient.
Lorraine's team, just given what you mentioned, they're the YouTube creator little shorts on this topic which engage the average citizen in really clever ways. So it's as a good example of what Jen's talking about.
And if somebody wants to do Cyber Schoolhouse Rock, you know what I'm talking about. Right?
Oh, I don't know.
Just a
They might
bill,
not, Jen, yeah.
only a bill. Okay.
Well, we could go on with this forever, but we have run out of time. But I hope from this conversation it's clear to everybody why it is that we come at the New York Times to cover cyber as fundamentally a national security issue, not really as a technical issue. There are lots of technical publications. There are lots of technical elements of the solution, but you know, we were in a nuclear age, we've been in a cyber age, we're going back to our nuclear age, and this is why it's so core to national security throughout. I thank you all for this and look forward to our next discussions. Thank you very much.